Good morning. Hopefully everybody is surviving the desert heat and the sin. I'm Jason Erickson. I've been building FileMaker database systems, custom applications for over 20 years. This is my 18th DevCon. I'm going to talk today about basically three things. We're going to talk about improving performance for live dashboards. We're going to look at how to easily create crosstab reports in FileMaker. And we're also going to look at ways to create rich Excel exports from FileMaker data, or excuse me, reports using FileMaker data. I built my first FileMaker database in 1995 while I was an admin assistant for an artist. I was also attending UC Berkeley. I was thrown a box of FileMaker, and they said, build me a Rolodex. I really have never looked back since. I love it. I'm sure that is a commonly shared fact amongst most of us in here. I'm also recently FileMaker 15 certified, and also 14, 13, 12, and going on back. So we're going to talk about advanced reporting. As I mentioned, first thing we're going to delve into is just improving performance for live dashboards in cases where you're pulling summary data in. We're going to look at some ways that you can actually make that performance a bit better. Then we're going to delve into the crosstab reports. Just to clarify what crosstab means for anybody who's not familiar, this is essentially taking data that would easily be presented in FileMaker in a vertical fashion, summarized in a vertical fashion, and turning it on its side and showing it horizontally, which is not necessarily a simple thing to do in FileMaker, although there's a number of techniques, and we'll talk about a couple. Finally, we're going to move on to producing formatted Excel exports, and we'll actually look at a couple different techniques. One a little more basic for simple needs, and another for actually very complex needs. So first, let's delve into live dashboard challenges. What we're talking about here essentially is a case where you've got summary information. Maybe you're presenting it in graphs. Maybe it's some other kind of format. Maybe it's just a summary list. But the problem becomes that using the normal techniques where you have unstored calcs and you're reaching into various different child tables from, let's say, a dashboard layout, pulling that information in and constantly having to reevaluate it can be pretty slow. So this definitely does create likely performance issues. It doesn't really matter how awesome the dashboard is that you built if your client has to sit and wait for it and constantly wait for it to refresh. The benefit gets lost, right? So what we're going to do is look at three approaches, three basic things that you think, or that I think you can take advantage of in many cases to improve performance. It's not going to be the be-all, end-all, but there's definitely circumstances where this is helpful. First one we're going to look at, change the data model. And we'll talk about a particular use case. But here what we're saying is instead of on the fly going and trying to find that information and summarize it, store it as you go. And it does, it's good for some circumstances and not for others. And we'll talk about a couple of those cases. We'll look at summarized import-export as essentially a very similar but alternative approach to accomplish some of the same thing. And then we'll look at using get FoundCount versus count, which is extremely fast way of getting at counts, and we'll look at a couple scenarios there. So first off, let's just kind of draw a example. In this particular case, we're going to be looking at a sales summary by sales rep, and it accumulated often on a weekly, or in this case, in a weekly basis. And the requirements in this case, a number of calculations and metrics and analytics used to evaluate rep performance throughout the week so that managers can keep their eye on how their reps are doing, essentially. And so we need remaining quarter to goal, average sales per week, sales year to date, percentage of goal to target, and weekly target remaining. Now, all of these are deriving off of a number of calculations largely based on order totals. And so even though the number of calculations have to be driven, if we could simply store a couple of those, we could then do calculations off of those stored values to dramatically improve performance. And I said earlier, you could start with unstored calcs in, let's say you have a reps table, and you could go in there and create some unstored calcs there, and then some unstored calcs off of those calcs. That's slow. It's not going to work well. So we're going to look at the data model approach first. Essentially, we're going to be making a rep weeks table so that, and I should say, even though we're looking at a listing of reps, a number of their metrics are driven by week. So storing per rep per week their totals gives us the ability to look across the year, do various calculations, and never be looking at more than 52 records. So we create one row per rep per week, and we use layout triggers, or could use layout triggers, certainly not the only option, but use layout triggers to essentially update rep weeks as reps commit orders. And this is just obviously an example case. In our particular case, and this was a live environment that we built for somebody, we saw dramatic improvement, 600%. So let's just talk about a couple of the reasons, or a few of the reasons why you might want to do a data model change, and then we'll look at some of the reasons why it might be difficult. If we're talking about a frequently viewed environment, a live dashboard, something that people are on very often, this is one reason. Certainly if the data is constantly changing, trying to do it, let's say nightly, maybe isn't going to suffice. And as I mentioned earlier, we're doing multiple calcs and summaries off of the information we essentially need to store that we would otherwise be grabbing on the fly. Now, this one's critical, obviously. The act of storing that data every time a rep commits a record, in this example, can't itself cause a performance drain, because then obviously we're not helping anything. As I mentioned, these are not hard and fast rules. There's just a few examples or things to consider. Let's look at some of the things that might get in the way. First off, you have to avoid commit conflicts between users. Now, in this particular example scenario, a rep is updating their record. So there is very little likelihood of anybody having a conflict. But you can imagine in a case where you're summarizing a different type of data, you could have a number of users trying to hit that information at any point. So you'd have to protect for that in your scripting. Last thing you want to have is a user see a dialog saying record locked, and they have no idea what's going on. But you can trap for it, and there are ways around checking to see when the record becomes available and telling a user, please try again, along those lines. Another one, of course, record deletion. Definitely something you could easily miss at first, but of course, if a record can be deleted and we're only tracking on layout trigger, then we have no way of knowing that a particular piece of data has been removed from the summary, so you have to trap for record deletion. And along those same lines, the solution has to be buttoned down. If you're relying on layout triggers at a data integrity level, you better have a solution where you know nobody's going to go in and make a modification in another file, on another layout, etc. So this is definitely good for some cases and not for others. You could be inheriting a system that's very complex and has layouts all over the place, and it's just not practical to think you're going to go through and button it all down. So as an alternative, something to consider anyway, is import-export, using summarized import-export. This has a lot of the same benefits that you would get from storing the data, but you just simply, it's not live, you have near live. And you have to consider how it is you're going to occasionally update that data when it's needed to be presented. The whole point behind this is built on FileMaker's very powerful capability to summarize or export summarized data. And that's fundamental to this concept. First and foremost, if you're going to use this, the point here is you have summary fields in the data tables that you can utilize to then export out in a summarized way. So you're going to have to create your summary fields first. And of course, you're going to be finding and sorting a set of records. In my case, I'd be finding the orders for this week because I want to export out the current set of data. I will have already stored in a previous point the information from previous weeks. What I'm trying to do is handle the fact that during the week, I occasionally need to see updated information about the week's information. So I'd be finding the orders for this week, and I'd be sorting them by staff because that's what we're after. And not critical if you can't see that. It's just showing AKF staff being sorted. And then we would be exporting the records. And here we're going to be taking advantage of the group by option up on the top. And I will say at this point, it's not a good idea to think you can summarize or sub-summarize by multiple criteria with this technique, because if you do group by more than one thing, you're going to have holes in the data that gets exported. So there's really this technique, this specific use of summarize exported is meant for one group by. which for this particular case works perfectly well. So we're going to group by a break field, AKF staff. We're going to pick some key fields. In order to be able to import this back in and know what I'm looking at, I need to know, in this case, AKF staff, who is the staff member, and what week are we talking about. We're also then going to be picking our summary fields, and when you do that with a break field or with a group by field, you're going to get 2 entries per field that you pick, per summary field that you pick. And one of them is going to say by, and then the group by field. And that's the one we're after. We don't care about the overall. The other one you're seeing is the overall summary, which is not relevant to our current situation. So then you probably want to remove those just so that they don't get in your way. And then just to show you that whole thing a little bit blown up. So I end up with AKF staff and date week, and then in my case, 3 summary fields that I want to look at. And each one of them ends in by, and then the name of whatever my group by is. I do want to say, by the way, I didn't really mention, but I'm welcome to take questions along the way. If it feels like the pace gets off at any point, that's we'll deal with that at that point. But I do want anybody to feel free to ask questions if there's anything unclear. So once we've exported our data, we now have to get it in. Typically, you'd be doing this, I would assume, without the existence of a table that you'd want to be using. So one of the handy things that you have in FileMaker is the ability to say, choose new table on import. So we can actually create a table to now store this information. If you already have the table, great. And it's sort of another thing to point out is when you do your export, it probably makes sense to name that export file something convenient, because that's what FileMaker is going to automatically offer you as the name of that new table. Not that you couldn't change it, but it just makes things a little easier. So now that we've done the export and the import, and I did this manually or showed this manually because it's kind of handy, it makes writing the script a bit easier because everything's going to be filled out for you, and by doing it that way, it allowed you to create a new table in the process. So we're going to create an update script, and I'll just talk sort of pseudocode-wise about what that would take. Assumably, we're going from a dashboard to some layout. In my case, it'd be orders. We're going to find the records that we need. We're going to sort those records. We're going to set a path variable. So since we're going to export the data and import it back in, and it's not a file that we're creating for somebody's consumption, you probably want to put it somewhere like the temporary folder, which is very easy to do if you set a variable to get temporary path and then include whatever file name you want. Then you can use that same path variable both for the export and for the import. And you're going to summarize export, and since we already did it once manually, when you add the export step, it should be all filled out for you nicely and ready to go. And now that we've exported the data, we're going to go to a layout that we want to import into, fairly straightforward. You're going to clear out the data potentially. I mean, here comes a situation where you really have to decide. Am I clearing out a table and refreshing it completely? In my case, am I just simply finding whichever records for this particular staff member or all the staff members for the week and clearing those out? That's a consideration that's obviously going to vary based on need, but you have to consider, am I writing over stuff or adding to stuff, right? And in this particular case, I'm just assuming, in this example anyway, I'm assuming I just clear it all out. And then you're going to import your records in and go back to your original layout and take advantage of the information. I'll just throw up a script here. There's a little bit more to it than I said. The only additions to it were just a couple error traps. One to make sure my FoundCount was greater than 0 before I bothered proceeding, and the other to make sure that export didn't fail for a variety of possible reasons. So once we've got that information now available in a table, we want to take advantage of it. You're probably going to be doing something like adding it to maybe a portal on a layout. Maybe you're making a graph out of it. Hard to say exactly. In this particular case, because I'm clearing out all records, I'm using a Cartesian relationship to connect from my home or from my dashboard screen into that new table because I just want to see all records. But there might be a key field or something else that you would want to use. And then, of course, the key here is you have to come up with, how am I going to refresh this data? What's the mechanism? Maybe it's a button on the layout, and the users know. If I want to see fresh data, I click button. Maybe that's not sufficient. Oftentimes it wouldn't be. A couple other things to consider. On-enter trigger could obviously, on-enter layout trigger could be used. You might even consider a server-side script, something you could time to happen every hour, every 5 minutes, maybe once a day. Obviously, it's going to vary based on the needs of your particular solution. Okay, so before I continue with that, I just want to see if anybody has any questions relative to that, if any of that's unclear. Cool, okay. So then the next one we're talking about is using getFoundCount instead of count. And essentially what this involves is, let's assume I'm on a layout that I want to show total orders per rep per month. And I got to get that count, and I got to go across every month. Well, I could create a bunch of relationships, each one for each month, for each rep, or maybe not even for each rep, and I could use count in an unstored calc, and it would look across each of those relationships and count up the records. In a large system, that can be really, really slow. And so this technique, which by the way was first presented by Daniel Wood in an article back in 2010, absolutely gets behind that in some really awesome ways. First of all, if you just simply create an unstored calc in your child table that you're counting, and you put getFoundCount in it as the entire formula, then you can point to that field across relationships, and it immediately tells you the number of records that you're trying to count up. That'll be relative to whatever portal you're looking at it. And the very coolest part of this is you can actually take advantage of this in filtered portals. So unlike summary fields, which of course in a filtered portal are not going to give you filtered results, this does. So it means I could literally put 12 portals, one-row portals across the top of a layout, stick the exact same relationship onto each portal, stick that unstored getFoundCount field in it, and filter by month for each of the portals, and I will have a very snappy way of showing the totals without having to make any new relationships. So this is a very powerful capability when we're talking about counting, not about other summary types of data, of course. Okay, so we've looked at 3 different possible ways to improve live dashboards. I'll just take a quick summary moment here to discuss them. We talked about changing the data model and using potentially layout triggers, although other types of mechanisms could be used for that. We talked about using summarized exports and imports as an alternative to doing that without having to change the data model. And we looked at the replacing counts with getFoundCount. These are not mutually exclusive, obviously. I mean, the means by which I could be storing my data model, you certainly might want to take advantage of a regular export-import script that happens instead of a layout trigger. And obviously, in conjunction with both of those, you might still want to use the getFoundCount approach over doing counts. So let's move on and let's talk a little bit about crosstab reports. So here's a typical report you might build in FileMaker. You could have built this using the layout wizard and not know a whole lot about reporting at all. And what we have here is a list of salespeople, and I'm seeing their quarterly totals. And very easily in FileMaker, I could do that in a vertical fashion. But as you can see, this report's likely to take up a lot of pages in a large organization. What we really want to see is something more like that. And in here, I've even been able to sub-summarize it by year to provide further meaning. Now, you could say, well, with quarters, there's only 4. Is it really that bad? I could just create, 4 calc fields, 4 summary fields for those, so a total of 8 new fields. Not a big deal. It's not really that challenging. And that's true for a quarter. But you can imagine a whole lot of other types of data that you might want to show in a crosstab format where you can't even predict how many ultimate columns you're going to need to show because the data is growing and changing. We're talking about essentially phantom columns. So there does need to be some technique that you use, and I wouldn't recommend one that involves hard-coded calcs for each possible capability because it's just not necessary. There's better ways to do it. I'm going to look at, and by the way, I should say, there's a whole lot of ways to do it. You do a little Google search for FileMaker crosstab, you'll come up with tons of articles. And you know what? Each of those approaches are interesting, and I'm not here to try and say this is the better approach. In fact, these are approaches that are probably the most commonly talked about. What we're going to look at is using calculated repeating fields. I know I said repeating field. It's a bad word. And in my opinion, it is a bad word when it comes to storing data. But these are very powerful fields to be able to use for a variety of things, including something like this. So we'll look at doing that. We'll also be looking at virtual lists. This is something that Bruce Roberts introduced a few years ago. And again, tons and tons of articles about virtual lists and different techniques people are using to do it. We're just going to delve into a couple of them. Another approach that I'm not going to discuss, but is also very powerful, similar to a virtual list, but it has a little bit more flexibility, is using web portals. web viewers. And the content here would be you get your data, and then you use some interesting HTML and JavaScript and some other things and tools and libraries and whatever you want to come up with. It just goes a little bit beyond the scope of this, so we decided not to really cover that one. But it is definitely an interesting avenue that people are now looking at, and some resources out there that are useful. So we're back to looking at example of our by quarter. The repeating field approach, is great for simple needs. If you have to do multiple different crosstab columns, maybe it's not the best approach. You could certainly still do it because you can choose which repeating values to show, and you could break it up and still take advantage of this approach. But really where it's awesome and simple and elegant is where you just need to show one value like we're doing here. Order total by quarter versus order total, order count, order profit, etc., right? If you had multiple things, maybe this isn't the best way to go. So all we need is 2 repeating fields. And it is also extremely useful, this technique, because it gives you an easy way to sub-summarize your information. In my example, I'm showing both a sub-summary by rep, and I'm also showing a summary by year and a sub-summary by rep. I could add multiple sub-summaries very easily, just like any field in FileMaker. So this does have the advantage in that particular case. And the source calcs themselves, assumably in the parent table, could potentially be stored, which also has some performance benefits as well. So we'll just look at the process. Oh, I should say though, this technique is really only useful and has to be implemented with in mind the notion of what is my max number of repeats that I'll need. So as I mentioned, some types of crosstab reports you could never predict. This probably wouldn't be a good technique for using for that. But if I can predict, well, at most I might have 12, I might have 15, I might have 20, then you can create a repeating field with that number, and it doesn't matter if you use them all or not, you simply have that outer limit. The way this essentially works is the use of 2 calculation functions, get calculation repetition number and extend. And I'm going to look at a calc formula and we'll see how those 2 things come together. So here I'm looking to get at sales rep by quarter. So I've created a calculated repeating field with only 4 repetitions, and I'm doing a reasonably simple test. In my quarter field, it happens to be Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. So the first piece of this is to break out that into its last character. And I will say we've got extend has to be inside of that. So in other words, the extend function itself does not let you do anything inside of it other than reference a field. So the first thing we do is extend our quarter. And any field you want to include in this calculation formula has to be extended or the calc will break and you will only have the first repetition filled out. The next thing we're going to do once I have either a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4 is I'm now going to compare it to the calculation repetition number. So the way these functions work is if you have a repeating field, a repeating calc field, FileMaker will evaluate for every repetition. Every time it does, it returns the current calculation repetition number, which is what gives you the ability to control where to put the data. So it's pretty simple in this particular case because my calculation repetition number literally corresponds to my test variable. It's a 1, a 2, a 3, or a 4. It's not always that simple. Sometimes you're going to have some other criteria that you're going to have to use to evaluate. And in those cases, here I've said what? Some field equals some value A, B, C, or D. You have to combine that with the repetition number as part of the condition. So I used a let function so I didn't have to keep repeating that long calculation function, calculation repetition number, but I'm nonetheless including rep equals 1, 2, 3, or 4 in a case statement so I can decide if some other criteria is met and the current repetition is 1, in this case put in order total. It's a little clunky with order total on every line. I tried to think of something that would make that a little simpler, but that's okay. You get the point. As you go through, you'll come up with ways, I'm sure, to improve the kind of syntax. Okay, so once we have a repeating calc field, then all we need to do is add a repeating summary field. And of course, first thing we're going to do is create the repeating summary, or excuse me, the summary field. Second thing we're going to do is pick our calc field that we just created and choose what type of summary we're doing. In our case, it's a total. It obviously could be average, count, minimum, maximum, etc. critical piece of making this turn into a repeating field is choosing, under summarize repetitions, changing it to individually. And what will happen here is you don't have to specify the number of repetitions. FileMaker will automatically decide how many repetitions to give the summary field based on how many repetitions the source calc has. So it will just automatically say, yes, you need 4 repeating summary fields as well. And that's really it, but we'll take a little deeper look at using it and implementing it on a layout. First thing you'd probably want to do, though, is you'd want to put your actual calc field on a layout somewhere, stick it next to whatever criteria you're using to do your test. In my case, it's the quarter, and actually make sure the results are what you want. I know we never make mistakes, but sometimes it's still good to check. And then we're ready to make our layout. And it's pretty straightforward. And I'll actually show this live here in just a second. But we're just adding a layout. We're creating as many subsummary parts as we want into each subsummary part in addition to the data for that subsummary. So for instance, a little hard to see here, but you can see D, date, year on the first row, and you can see name full there, hopefully anyway, on the second row. But in addition to that information, you're then simply taking your summary field, spreading out the repetitions, so choosing to display all the repetitions horizontally, of course, and then you can put that same summary field into every part you want, including in the footer if you want to show a grand total. So let's just take a look at that briefly. I think for the most part that should be reasonably clear. All right, let's zoom in there. So I've got a simple file here called repeating pivot, and we've got 4 fields, about 2,000 records, and we have an order number, a date for the order, a date quarter, and an order total. And I've also made our 2 fields that we were discussing. Let's just drag that guy next to it so you can see. So there's my calculation field, and it's got 4 repeats, and same formula as we were looking at earlier. I have both formulas in here. This one's in comments, but this is the one we were looking at. Right, same formula. And we've got our summary field as well, which, as I mentioned, simply chooses individually over all together as the means by which it turns it into a repeating field mirroring the calc. And I've also made a layout, as we discussed. Looks just like the screenshot. Come on. Okay. Where we've got date, year, name full, pointing to a staff table, and 3 instances of my summary field, which then gives me my report automatically. Now, at the moment, of course, I have it already sorted, but I guess I should mention, when you go to this layout, of course, you have to sort it by the criteria that you want to see it sub-summarized. Right. So let's just summarize that a bit. This technique, hopefully you see, pretty simple, pretty easy. Not difficult to do, just takes a couple fields. Pretty flexible. You can put it into multiple subsummary parts, so you have great flexibility there. It's not perfect for dashboards, of course, because this requires a traditional FileMaker report approach. You have to be on a list screen, you have to have it sorted the way you need. So when it does come to that type of environment, you're probably looking at another approach. And that's what virtual lists can handle. So this is an extremely powerful and dynamic means for doing things. There are obviously limitations here as well. But actually, could I just see a show of hands how many people already familiar with, use virtual lists? Yeah, okay, well, a wide number. Maybe you'll learn something a little different about the way we're doing it. And for those of you who haven't seen it, hopefully this will be something that's an eye-opener. So what we're looking at in this particular case is the requirement to create a delimited block of text that you're going to use to then parse out across a pre-created set of records. And we'll look at how this all works. But the general concept is that you have a utility table. It's got thousands of records in it if that's what you need, hundreds if that's what you need, whatever. And there's no stored data in it per se. And you are then laying over the top of that a CSV, a comma-separated block of data, and using unstored calcs to simply parse that out on the fly across rows and across columns so you can then display it in portals and do other things with it. And as we can see here, we're looking at a particular example which now looks at products cross-tabbed by product category over years. And we'll look at, we'll actually do some of that in a live demo, in fact. Now this, again, as I mentioned with the cross-tab, tons of resources. You do a Google search, you'll come up with literally articles that are still coming out. And as new layout objects come out, people are coming up with new and interesting ways to use those. For instance, button bars, now being used as a means to display the data instead of in a field. All very cool. And again, I'm not going to cover every different option. I've put my own little flair on it, and we'll look at that. Okay, so before we delve into that, I'm just going to jump into Manage Database. I'm going to show you a couple different variations of what is essentially the same approach. I've made this as dynamic as I could. First and foremost, we're not assuming delimiter, so we're going to have two globals that tell us our row and our column delimitators. I'm also, and this varies from I think every other approach I've seen, I'm not using a serial increment because as far as I can tell it's not necessary. Using an unstored calc with get record number gives me the ability to make this extremely dynamic. I can point at any set of records, and whatever set of records I've either found in a list or I'm looking at in a portal, I will automatically get exactly what I need, record 1 through X many rows. So the need to maintain an increment does seem to be an unnecessary step. The next thing we're doing, I'm using essentially 3 fields to get at a block of data. The first one is just the name of a stored formula. So I've put into this solution a little formula table. I didn't use an ID. I just have formula name, formula, and header formula, and I'll talk about header formula a little bit later. So this just simply gives me the means to pick a particular formula that I want to use right now. My next field is a global as well, so not an unstored calc, but it uses auto entry to trigger off of the formula name and pick that particular formula. And the reason I'm making it unstored global, and making it global, not an unstored calc, is because I don't want this to refresh constantly. I don't want to risk having it reevaluate simply because I changed layouts or moved around. It's not going to refresh until I change formula name, and that's a big benefit. And as we see, it's just pulling in the formula itself. Our third field, also global, also with auto entry, is evaluating that. So while I'm going to look at SQL specifically in these examples, it's not limited to that. You could use anything that you can pass through a calc formula, and you're just going to evaluate it. And that's going to then return, essentially, or what it must return is a block of data that's comma, or however, that's delimited in the means that I've said my delimiters are set up. This is kind of a convenience calc. It's not really required, but it makes it a little easier when it comes to parsing the data out into columns. I've just picked out the current row. And so I'm using get value so that I can pick a particular value, and I'm substituting the data result for whatever the row delimiter is with a carriage return so that I get an actual list. So if my row delimiter was a word or some other set of characters because I couldn't use carriage returns because it was going to violate contents of the fields themselves, I'm nonetheless in the end still separating it out and then getting that particular row number. And then I've created 5 column formulas, and if you look, it's a little hard to see, but there we go, like that. They're identical. There's no difference between them, and I could duplicate this 100 times. The difference is each one of them has a final the end of each field name is the number corresponding to the column I want to get. So I'm simply using that. I'm deriving what the number is, and then I'm using that number to decide which column to pull out of my block of data for the current row. So this just makes it easy. If I needed to dupe, I could just bam, 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 bam. I do have to rename them, but I don't have to go in and change the formula, which can be handy if you're doing a lot of fields. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Yeah. No, thank you. It's a good question. I'll demonstrate what the difference is there. I'm not actually grabbing a particular piece of the data. I think I am anyway. Let's see. Oh, I am actually. So yes, a better means could be to filter for the particular numbers. Thank you. I actually thought I'd written it that way, but no. Yeah. This would only work up to 10. However, you could easily modify the formula to pull out the number portion, or up to 2, or however you want to do it. Right? You could do 01 through 99 and still take 2 characters reliably, or you could be more clever and figure out on a filter or something like that where the numbers were. There you go. So the general idea here is however you want to write the calc, if you can, write it in a dynamic way and make it simpler for you later so that it's easy to expand.
The thing is, get as number takes out all the text.
There you go. Get as number. Okay, so we've got a few fields on here. I'm going to kind of move around this. Well, actually, let's see if we can do this. Okay. I'll still zoom in on a couple spots. So I'm going to pick a particular formula. I'm going to just pick my simple formula. And in this particular case, it's just an execute SQL. So the content of the field isn't just a SQL query, but it's the actual calc formula I want to do. So in this case, it has to be execute SQL as well. Maybe I'm doing list, and I'm pulling data from across a relationship. But in this particular case, I'm just simply pulling from a table called categories, which only has 2 fields in it. And so if we zoom out, we see that my data result is just a list of data from that particular table, separated by commas. And if we come down here, on any given row, we see that I've got that row number's value in my data row. And then finally, we've got a little, this is just a Cartesian self-join relationship to the same table I'm in to display the results. And I've put, sorry about that. Let's go a little slower here. I've put 4 of the columns in, so it'll display up to 4 rows. In this case, I only have 2, so it's only showing 2 values. If I change my formula to go to a completely different table, and this is sort of helps to illustrate the brilliance of this technique, then I get that data out of my result, and I display a completely different set of data in the same portal. And that's sort of the whole beauty behind this approach, is that one portal, one object, one layout, whatever it is, has this utility effect of being usable for multiple different things. Now you might have 10 of these layouts, one with up to 5 columns and one with up to 10 columns, and et cetera, but nonetheless you could still pass hundreds of different reports through it. But we were talking about pivot reports, and this is not a pivot report. So let's move on to our second example. I call it pivot report, it really should be crosstab. Okay, so slightly different variation, but we can move through this a bit more quickly because most of these are the same. So I've got a lot of the same initial things, pretty much all the way up to here. Then I've also included 2 more fields, header formula and header result. Pretty much follows the same principle as the data. I've included a header formula with my formula, as we saw earlier. And so I'm pulling that formula out and then evaluating it in the next field, header result, which does the exact same thing. Only in this case, I'm now using repeating fields instead of hard-coded fields. So we're sort of combining our pivot report, crosstab report, repeating field calc system with virtual lists. And I've got up to 10 possible columns. So I've got 10 header columns, and I've got up to 10 values. I've also made a text field and a number field. And they have the exact same formula, they're just simply different data types. And the point behind this is if I want to show currency information, for instance, then I have a field available to me that I can do that with without having to do extra calculations on the data itself to try and decide what currency symbol to show and should there be a comma and et cetera. Whereas, of course, sometimes I don't want a number, I want text. So let's look at this. Zoom out again. So I'll pick a different formula this time. I'm going to pick pivot. And I'm going to talk about this just for a second. There's a custom function in here called pivot SQL, excuse me. I'm not going to go through the details of that. You can dig into the example and check it out. But the point behind it is I pass it some criteria, I tell it what to break on, and I get back a SQL query. So I don't have to sit here and write up a complex summary-based SQL query to get a crosstab or a pivot report. And let me just show you the result of just running the pivot SQL function. So this is what the pivot SQL is actually returning, which is a SQL query that's going to do a test across up to, well, actually I should say it's dynamic in the sense that I'm passing it in criteria. What do I want to pivot on? I want to pivot on product category. So we query for product category from the categories table, and we order by category, and we pass that in as criteria to the pivot report. So it then dynamically knows how many of these tests to do. And on each particular test, we're saying, look, if the product category is equal to a specific value, all right, we're going to call this column 1, and we're going to get at a formula which will be unit price times quantity. If it's not, and this is critical, this is where the else comes in, I have to put in a 0. I have to have an else 0 as part of that criteria, otherwise I'm going to leave holes in the data. So if I do a null here, I would end up creating pockets, and I don't want to do that. So let's go back to our actual results that we're after. So that returns then, and I should say I'm ordering by year, so that was part of this criteria, and that's part of how the pivot SQL function works. It gives you the ability to summarize by one criteria, not multiple. So I get a year as my first value, and then I get the totals by that product, or by each product category for that particular year. So let's move on to the header formula. So I want to dynamically also put headers across this, so I don't have to predict what they'll be. The first one is going to be year, because I know no matter what, my first column is going to be year. So in this particular case, again, this is a calc formula, not necessarily SQL. Go like that. I'm using a list function, and I'm simply putting year as the first value in my list, and then I'm making the remaining values be the result of a SQL query. Execute SQL, go into category, and pick out the category name. And this is critical. You need to order, of course, by category here as well, because we did that when we passed in the pivot SQL calc. I don't want to put the wrong values next to the wrong product categories. And then with that, I now have, let's just zoom out. I now have a fairly dynamic, up to the number of repeats I predicted at least, means for showing a crosstab report. And it's also got dynamic columns. The way that we are, and I guess I should also point out, if we zoom out a bit here, one of the advantages of the repeating field, kind of like the button bar approach, is by using a repeating field, it makes it easily able to slide gracefully without running over each other, which would be hard to do with a bunch of individual fields. And the way we did that and made that work, of course, is year is a text field, so it's a single entry. And then I used my number field for the remainder, but of course I had to start on repetition number 2 because I don't want to show the year again in my number field. So here and here, we've used starting at second repetition out to the 10th repetition. Is that, any questions about that? Okay, cool. So just to look at the virtual lists a little bit in detail or in summary, it's definitely a powerful and very dynamic. You can do a lot with it, and you definitely have the means to do more sophisticated things than we're doing here. It's not, well, and I should say, it also gives you the ability, as I mentioned, to share common resources and reuse. But it's not necessarily great for doing sub-summaries. Don't get me wrong. You could write a looping script and a loop within the loop, and you could definitely pull data from multiple places and create what effectively would be sub-summary parts. And you could do a whole lot of extra work then to try and make those look stylistically different. That's all available. It just starts to get a bit cumbersome and onerous if that's what you're after. So I would say this is really best suited for a more basic, straight listing. Whereas the other approach, where possible, has broad capability to be sub-summarized in whatever way you want. And that's the repeating field approach that we looked at initially. All right, I'm about to move on to the Excel portion. Just want to make sure no more questions about any of the previous stuff we've covered. Very good. So we're going to look at a couple different things relative to creating Excel reports. We all talk a lot about how Excel needs to be put away and you need to start working in FileMaker, and that makes sense. Don't store your data in Excel. Store your data in a relational database. But Excel's also an extremely powerful tool for doing reporting and for allowing you to send things that are active, not like PDFs, to customers and to partners. So we focused a little bit on how you can best do that. And we came up with a couple use cases, sort of the most likely two that we thought. And we're going to look at both of those. We're going to talk about simply using XML export with XSLT as a quick means for changing column headers, which is probably about 90% of the time you have a client asking for something in Excel. They just don't want those ugly FileMaker field names that you use to have good conventions. They want to see their own things. Then we're actually going to look at something a bit more sophisticated. We're going to inject data into an existing Excel file, and this is Excel 2012. So we're not talking about old format stuff here. This is being able to use the latest modern capabilities in Excel. We're not looking at a third alternative, which is definitely there and available and powerful, but I think well covered and a topic unto itself, and that's using FileMaker as a back-end data source from Excel and doing queries into it. So that's absolutely very valid, but not covered. So first of all, let's just look at the formatted Excel file that has, or excuse me, for producing column headers. So here's sort of an example of what we might be looking at. In our particular table, we've got AKS order and D date order with underscores and et cetera. And that's not what the client wants to see. They want to just see human readable column headers. And that's all. Otherwise, they just want their data spit out into Excel. So we'll look at a means for doing that. We've provided in the examples an XSLT file that you can use. Pretty simple approach. You don't have to know a whole lot about XML or XSLT or any of that stuff to, I think, wrap your head around what you would do to alter this to meet your needs. What we're basically taking is one section in this example file that has the column labels, and we included, it looks like four, excuse me. To alter this, simply change the names, add additional rows if you need to. The things to point out, we're creating a CSV file. So part of this entry has to include a comma, and I hope people can see that. I'll zoom in on an actual live example if anybody needs to see. But for each entry, we've done the name that we want, a comma, and then we moved on to the last one. And I will point out that the last entry should not have a comma. So order total is my last entry. Of course, it's the end of the line, so we don't want a comma there. And then the final entry below it needs to be maintained, which is an XML encoded carriage return, character 13. And then similarly, for the section below, you just need to edit it and have a corresponding number of call entries, 1, 2, 3, 4 here. And again, you have to sort of honor the fact that the first three entries out of 4 need a comma, and below all of that, you need a carriage return. So that after each row, this is going to get looped through. You then get a carriage return at the end. To use this, assumably you'd be creating a script, and you'd be using file type XML, and again, probably using a path variable as a means to do this dynamically. And if you pick XML as the export type, then you're going to get a second dialog that comes up, which is going to let you pick if you want to use an XSLT style sheet, which is exactly what we're doing here, and then you're picking your style sheet. I will point out that you could reference that online if you need to. You could be using the calculation version to then be pointing to a path variable. I'm not really detailing that. We looked at some of the mechanisms involved with exporting data out, or we will actually in another case. The general point behind this is you point it to an XSLT file, and it's now going to turn that XML into a CSV, and that CSV can then automatically be opened in Excel. And so we'll look at that just so we can see how that works. And I put that into the repeating pivot example, so it does not have its own example, but we've got a script here. Excel, export to Excel, and boom, we get our little Excel file. And if we zoom in on that, cool, cool, cool. Now, also to point out, I have one other script just to show that you're not limited to just straight row per row. We can take advantage of summarized import-export again here. Well, summarized export anyway. We've got another script that simply does that with a summary breaking on, I'll have to remind myself. Oh, am I wrong here? Okay. I'm on the wrong script. Okay, sorry about that. Thank you. So right, in this particular case, I've sorted the records, and I'm doing the same mechanism we looked at earlier. I'm sorting by staff. So the result of it is then a much more condensed report that still shows column headers at the top and allows me to then see simply by staff member what their totals were. And that's kind of cool. But notice, things like column resizing and other things are not handled by this. Styles, don't get me wrong, XSLT can be used to do more sophisticated things, but it does get pretty tricky. So what we came up with is something I think you'll find a bit more interesting and extremely useful. So what we want to do is be able to take some FileMaker data, and without a whole lot of scripting and a whole lot of effort and a whole lot of learning other kinds of things, be able to create reports like this in Excel. Extremely beautiful, however you want to format them, and things that you'd be proud to send out as branded company information or client information. To do that, I'm going to jump straight to a demo. So just as a kind of overview here, I've got, in this particular case, a personal budget. Oh, excuse me. Now I've got a personal budget. And to zoom in, come in here, we've got a record per month. So it's my monthly budget. This is February. And I've got monthly income, monthly expenses, and monthly savings. And those are actually, 4 different tables total, 3 child tables, basically. And what I want to do, as we looked at, is I want to come up with something that looks more like this, which got some beautiful charts and some graphs, easily relevant, easily tells me exactly what I'm looking for, and includes each of my bits of data. But I want to take the information that I have in my FileMaker file and put it in there. So I'd like some magic, basically. Like a button that I could just click on, and that would then spit out the data and produce my report, ready to send, ready to load into a file if needed to be stored. So what are we talking about? Well, I'm announcing right now a free product. It's been put up on GitHub. It's called Excel Injector, and I'm going to show you how to use it. That's pretty cool though, right? Come on. Give it to me. Thank you. So here's what we're doing. I think probably, let's do this. Let's look at it in here because I think it's a little easier to actually make sure we cover all the requirements. So the first thing you need to do is set up an Excel file to be encoded in such a way that allows it to be interacted with by us. And so we'll look at what that takes first. What we're taking advantage of is something called table objects in Excel. So not to be confused, I know we talk about Excel tables a lot. They're workbooks, they're worksheets, whatever you want to call them. They're not tables. Inside of Excel, there's something called a table. And the way you create one of those is you choose a range of cells, and then under the Insert menu, you pick Table. Once you do that, you get an entry, or I'm sorry, you get a dialog that asks you to confirm the range of cells that you want to use, and it gives you this all-important checkbox, My Table Has Headers, which you do need to select. Once you've changed that, or once you've selected that, it'll turn your range of cells into what looks like a basic table, and there will now be a Table tab available in the interface, which you'll need to click on to configure. And the first thing we're going to do is name the table as we want. I call this My Table. And then we're going to modify, and I will actually back up a second. When you create your range of cells, I don't care how many rows you ultimately want to have, you need to create it with 3 rows. You can make as many cells or columns as you want, but only 3 rows are required. And into those 3 rows, after you choose My Table Has Headers, that's going to take the first row. And then we're going to do something special on the next 2 rows. On the first row, the first data column, you're going to put in whatever example data you feel like putting in to tell the table how to format that information. Whatever style, whatever data typing you want to do. Here I've got I've got a date field and I've got 2 number fields that I've told to format as currency. On the third row, or I'm sorry, second data row, you're going to put in the names of your FileMaker fields. So you name the columns however you want to in Excel for whatever purpose you want for display, but that does become a named element that we can target. On the third row, you're putting in the FileMaker field names, and that basically creates the import map. Any questions on just the Excel piece in formatting that? Okay. So as I mentioned, first row, example data, second row, FM column names. So now we're going into FileMaker and we're setting up essentially a script in order to tell it what to do. First thing you want to do is copy and paste the InjectExcelData script out of our example. That does basically the work, and you do very little modification to that script. But we will look at that, and I'll blow this up in a second so you can see it closer. Essentially, and you could recraft these. I mean, once you get it, the scripts are not that complicated. It all comes down to one Apple script or Windows send event call that puts in the syntax. In this particular case, our injector hard codes 2 containers. There's an Excel file container, and there's the injector itself. I will say this is a Java-based utility, command line utility. If you're a script master fan, you could turn it into a plugin if you'd prefer. But the point is, it gets written out, you write it to the temporary folder if you want, and then you send some commands to it to tell it what to do using, as I mentioned, it's a command line. I will state at this point, it does require Java. However, you could do this server side if you wanted to. And in this case, you'd then be putting the results into some container field that could then be fed back to the client. Or you just simply make sure that your clients who are going to run this have Java. So here's a little closer look at that script and the changes you'd be making. So in our case, we're in a file called Personal Budget, and I got a container field called Excel Table Injector, and another one called Excel File.xslx. And into those, obviously, I've pasted the 2 things. So you'd want to reset these to be the fields that are in your file, and there's 2 references to each, one that gets the name, so get as text, and another one that actually exports the contents of that particular field. So once you've edited that particular injector script, then you just need to create a control script. And in the control script, the first step you're going to do, or a step you must do, is set a common global path variable. Again, you can retool these scripts. They're not that complex. But the way we set it up, we're assuming a global variable called path, which will contain the location where we're going to work. And I've used temporary path here. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to export records. In my case, it was 3 different tables. You might have 1, you might have 7. But for each one, you have to create a merge file that's going to contain the data you want to inject. And I say merge because we need it to be CSV and we need it to have column headers. Finally, once you've done that and you've got the files you want, you need to call the injector script and pass in as a param an instruction list of what you want it to do. And we're going to talk about the instruction list in just a second. So there's just a blow up of what's actually in the personal budget. I got 3 sections, each one exporting a merge file. And then I've got a 4th line at the bottom that simply calls the injector script and passes in some instructions, which we now look at. So you can create any combination of, and it's a list, you can create any combination of instructions of 2 types, table or cell. In table, you're using the keyword table with a colon, and then you're specifying the name of a table in Excel. So we looked at creating a table and giving it a name, equals, and then the name of a merge file that you've spit out. And then with that, as long as those column headers in the merge file match the last line of that table, it's simply going to do the rest of the work for you to inject all that data appropriately. And I will say this, it will grow, it will expand parts below it, it will grow next to other items next to it without interrupting them. So it's extremely powerful. And just as an example, because I see a couple curious looks, in our particular case, you'll see that we've got data that comes below the tables. We've got tables next to the tables, right? And when we injected our data, which I'll just redo, I think I threw that one away, but we'll just redo it. Oh, can't do it while it's open. So here it is. We don't have to redo it. So in our particular case, notice we grew this entire section, moved the totals down, and didn't interrupt any of the tables next to it. So this does give you some pretty powerful capability to inject data. So going back here, let's go back out. So here I've got a list of instructions. I've got 3 table instructions. And we also have the ability to do cell instructions. So if you wanted to, you could do 100 lines of put this cell here and put that cell here and put this into that cell and put that into that cell, and you can do that. I think in many cases where you have repetitive data, you're probably better off with a table object because it's a lot less work for you to do. Nonetheless, it does give you that, and for that syntax, we're just saying cell colon as a keyword, and then the name of a cell, for example, B2, and then whatever data you want to inject into that cell. And just to illustrate, because I don't think I pointed it out, we did that here. Personal budget for February was custom put in by the script. Okay? So that actually brings me to near close. I just want to take a second to summarize what we looked at. We did a simple approach using XML. It's a well-known technique. It's been out there for a while. We'll give you an example XSLT file if you don't have one that should be pretty easy to modify for your needs, and it gives you the ability to handle the common use case of I just want better column headers. And it's great for simple column modifications. And then, of course, we also introduced the Excel Injector utility, which gives you extremely powerful capability to produce rich reports using Excel. And that brings me to a close. Any questions? No? Okay. Thank you. Please do remember to fill out your evaluations and note that there will be some updates. In fact, somebody did mention to me that they tried to get at one of the, I think it was the slide PDF, and that they were having a hard time downloading it, so I'll make sure that that gets updated. And I have done some recent updates to the examples. So if you've already updated them or downloaded them, check back again, should be done by the end of the day. We're going to be in booth 124 for the rest of the day. Obviously, we're almost done, but let me show this guy. Thank you, Paul. So here is the location for the source. I mean, this is open source, so we're not only giving you the utility, sorry, getting there, but that's the location for the source. If anybody's a Java programmer and feels like adding to it or making improvements, source is up there and you can do what you wish. Okay, again, thank you. Yes.
Oh. Can you do multiple sheets?
Yes. I didn't include it in the, well, actually, yes. If you edit the content of the sorry, the AppleScript call, you'll see in there a note for which parameter you use to tell it to work on. Okay. So I kind of hard-coded it in the example to sheet 1, but you can definitely change it, and it's part of the syntax. Well, two ways you can get at it. It's embedded into the you were just looking at. So this guy, which is downloadable, or will be downloadable. I've been doing some updates to it, but it's available. This literally contains both the example that I'm using, the Excel file, and the injector, but it's also available on GitHub. Jack. There, just do this. So github.com/linearblue/Excel injector. It does work on Windows, yes.
Yes. The slide, the program before that, you had some data that was missing. Was that just because you didn't put it in there, or was there a reason that there was a date? You can't, it's behind that, what you got. Now, go to your program.
Here?
Yeah, up there at the top, and then.
Are you talking these particular columns?
No, the one at the very, date due, expense.
Sorry, date due. Oh, here. Yeah, I just didn't put in the data.
Okay, and then there's when you had to change on one side. Did you change expense and then go expense 2, 3, 4, or does something change that where it truncated part of the ENSE and put 2, 3, 4?
Oh yeah, no, sorry. This was just quickly pumping in some example information.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, no.
And yep, somebody's already downloaded it, tested it, and said it worked. So it doesn't just my machine. Any other questions? We have some more time. It just didn't seem like anybody really had any, but now people are starting to come up. Don't be shy. Okay, cool. Thank you. Yep, wait, one last question. Yep.
Are you able to references back into FileMaker data there?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Okay, so you're telling it to put a particular piece of information in a cell?
Yes.
I'm thinking about Erickson.
Yes, totally.
So when you're
Oh,
when you're saying cell,
yeah. Yeah.
refer back to FileMaker data.
Absolutely, absolutely. So here's sort of, this is my actual example instructions in this particular file. Let me just zoom in on that. And I just hard-coded it to keep it simple. But the bottom line is you're going to pass this as a parameter to that script. You can build this on the fly. So, have 3 lines, but you want to have this be, you're going to put it in B3, but you don't know what the data is, and so maybe you're using a custom function for doing merging that replaces in some FileMaker data, or maybe you're just going through a looping script and building this list, whatever. Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you can't just put a variable in there and expect the script will do anything, but you can put it together. You could have a merge calc that turns it into live data based on a reference to a field. That's not part of the utility, it's just how you choose to script it. Yeah, cool. Anything else? Yeah?
Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. Thank you.